Good afternoon, and welcome to all of our speakers, to all of our guests. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. On behalf of News24 and the campaign for the freedom of expression, I want to say thank you for your time. To our guests, thank you for your scholarship and promoting an atmosphere in which hopefully we can freely debate these issues that define our lives. And today's question certainly is one that speaks to that theme. I'm Iman Rapetti. I'm a broadcaster and author, and it gives me great pleasure to be your moderator for this session. We know that South Africa's lawmakers are grappling right now in our country with, the themes that are defining the appropriate remedies to racism and other forms of prejudice that undermine our society. We have to fight pervasive intolerance. We've got to fight racial discrimination. And to that end, the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill was introduced in Parliament 4 years ago. That was in April of 2018. And right now it's before Parliament. And it's an issue, of course, that's been divisive and controversial in South Africa. It's there for public hearings. Some people are labeling the bill in its current form unconstitutional. Others are arguing that there are already sufficient existing laws to deal with hate in our country. So our panel is tasked with discussing the question, what is the right punishment for racism? Our experts and commentators are Johannesburg attorney Boang Jones, who is fresh off his 11-year stint as South African Human Rights Commission head in Gauteng. Mark Oppenheimer is an advocate at the Johannesburg Bar, and he's fresh from the Equality Court representing AfriForum in their bid to have a contentious struggle chant declared hate speech. Professor Christie van der Westhuizen is Associate Professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. And Mbazima Shilowa is the former Premier of Gauteng, the former leader of COPE, and an impassioned commentator who once sent me a delicious bottle of his own wine brand, Epicurean, for my birthday. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you very much for giving us your time this afternoon. All protocol is observed. So we only have an hour, and in the spirit of winemaking, I'm encouraging our speakers to give us a rich distillation of their positions and thoughts, as rich and as distilled as they possibly can. I'm going to take questions from our audience in the chat. So I invite you, as you reflect on what's being discussed, as you think about your own questions and concerns, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will raise them throughout the course of our discussion this morning. So are we ready? I think we are. Let's get our panelists to open up our discussion today with each giving a 2-minute headline summation of their thoughts on the question, what is the right punishment for racism? We're going to kick off with Boang, and then we'll go to Mark, Christie, and Mbazima.
Thank you, Iman, and good afternoon to the viewers. My positionality is that racism should be punished and racists should be jailed. Racism has been a defining feature of our country for much of our history, and as a state policy, racial discrimination was lawful and well-resourced for over a century. However, the adoption of the 1996 Constitution provided a significant step towards a comprehensive strategy to address the historic legacies of racial and gender discrimination in the country. Despite the constitutional guarantee to equality, many South Africans still experience discrimination on a daily basis because of their race. Racists over the last 20 years have become more emboldened. In recent years, there's been a number of race-related statements communicated via social media, which show that we are still a nation in transition. We have been part of discussions and made submissions during my tenure at the Human Rights Commission on the hate crimes bill. Others have argued that the hate crimes bill does not go far enough in criminalizing hate speech and racism, as it would erode, or as criminalizing would erode the ability to exercise the right to free speech. So my position is that we should punish racists, as the number of measures that we've adopted over the years have not yielded results, and racists continue to undermine our constitutional aspirations of a nation that is based on human dignity, equality, and freedom.
Thanks, Boang.
So I think if we think about the term racist and how that the scope of it has enlarged over time, there is an enormous danger in criminalizing mere racism. So what was done during the Soviet era was to describe speech as pornographic. And a lot of people felt that pornographic material ought to be criminalized. And then you could imprison people for producing pornographic material. Often that material had nothing to do with sex. It had to do with ideas that were contrary to the will of the state. And so undoubtedly, there would be a danger in criminalizing racism, that those that are in power will decide what counts as racism. Now, an ordinary understanding to my mind is that if someone believes that a particular race is superior to another, that strikes me as a racist belief. But that on its own doesn't strike me as something that we should imprison someone for. Once we start to attach that belief to actions, then we can build up more of a case for having punishments or other kinds of civil sanctions. At the moment, our hate speech legislation is civil in character, and it's quite narrow in some senses. So it's not merely racist speech that counts as hate speech. There must be either a call to action in the sense that you are inciting one group to perform harm against another group, or that the words themselves are so deeply harmful that they cause such trauma and such an invasion of dignity, coupled with a propagation of hatred, that it amounts to hate speech. Our Constitutional Court in Kolani has already decided that hurtful words on their own aren't hate speech. The other thing that we must be open to is this idea that our Constitution really cares about equality before the law and values this value of non-racialism. And that means that you don't get to pick out which groups are capable of racism and which ones aren't. So a claim that is sometimes made is that Black people can't be racist, or that white people can't be the victims of racism. And that's not what's envisioned by our constitutional order. So when we think about who would be punished, it would be any group that targets another group. But of course, before we get to the idea of criminalizing speech, there are other ways of dealing with racism, like more speech, like persuading people in the public square that racism is a terrible view to hold, and that it's better to persuade people through reason than with the jackboots of the state. I think journalists in particular ought to be very concerned about the idea of being jailed, that they are those who are, spilling ink all the time and may very well be accused of expressing racist opinions, and of being the danger of being dragged off to a prison cell because their views are seen as unpalatable by those that are in power. And this is the kind of thing that we saw during apartheid, that we lived in a society where people were jailed for speech because it was viewed as causing racial discord by the apartheid state. And we, don't want to go back to such an authoritarian system.
Thanks, Mark. Christy?
Good to be with you today. So from my side, as somebody who studies race and who've looked into questions of whiteness, also in my new handbook of critical studies in whiteness that I've brought out with Routledge. What's of concern here is that if one has a piece of legislation like this, one runs the risk of, where you're basically saying that specific individuals must be prosecuted for perpetrating racist hate speech, for example. The problem with that for me is that you are basically running the risk of individualizing the problem and putting it into, say, a person like Penny Sparrow, etc. While race is a much more complicated phenomenon. It's a systemic, racism itself is systemic. It's been institutionalized in our country. We have to remember that we come from a background of colonialism and apartheid. While we've seen the formal end of apartheid, unfortunately, those legacies are running into the present. And so we're dealing actually with something that's systemic. We are dealing with something that's socially conditioned. This is something, in a sense, one can speak of a race thinking that we've been inducted into as South Africans. So the challenge before us is to actually, how will we actually think ourselves out of race? How will we think beyond race? Can we think beyond race? And racism for me speaks to that question. So what I'm worried about is that we're losing that systemic dimension, and we're trying to put racism into specific individuals who are then seen as problematic rather than addressing the structural questions. And as we know, specifically in South Africa, in the last few years, we have become more polarized from a social point of view. Our social cleavages are much worse. It seems to me that government is wanting to opt for something that speaks to certain kind of populist ideas around how does one address racism, rather than speaking to those bigger systemic issues of social cleavages that also specifically come out of socioeconomic cleavages. So it's actually also about what's happening in relation to socioeconomic inequality and so forth. And I also want to just draw attention to the fact that the bill that we're discussing today around it's on hate speech, but the race is not the only difference that's being addressed. Of course, we're looking also at sexuality, we're looking at gender, we're looking at nationality. If we think of the surge in xenophobia in our country. So we should actually, as a society, we should be addressing how we manage difference, all differences, not just racial differences, and how do we approach them. And again, so the kind of homing in on a single difference, and then also kind of a hyper individualization for me is problematic, and I'm hoping we can work our way through these very complex issues today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity. Let me just say that firstly, it is true that everyone is agreed that we should allow for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, some even say including freedom to insult. However, I think the focus is on the intention being to hurt someone. When people, deny the Holocaust, it has got very little to do with debate and discussions. It's aimed at belittling and the Jews. That, look, man, you're just being insensitive. The mass killings of Jews was not really that big a deal. Similarly, when people display the swastika in Germany, it's very little to do with this or that demonstration. So the same in South Africa. We must remember that the majority of South Africans face a racism of one sort or another on a daily basis, at work, in restaurants, in promotion, economic positions not being available, and so forth. So there's room for us to continue to debate those issues, to discuss them, to put in legislation, to educate people, to say, look, this is wrong. We need to change our society from point A to point B. But it's also important to be able to make examples of people who take extreme positions, knowing fully well that this is wrong. So I don't subscribe to the notion that says if somebody set out to hurt someone in terms of their sexual orientation, their race, beliefs, and so forth, that the only way is to say, please, man, don't do this again and again and again and again, you know. I believe that it's important that we find a remedy, and that remedy will obviously have to be constitutional. The final point I want to make is that in our country, it seems the burden is being put on those who are at the receiving end of hate speech, of racism, homophobic, and all of those, to be the one that tolerate and educate others why it is wrong, instead of those groups that are the ones that perpetuate these things being made to be in the forefront, talking to their own people, but saying to them, if you persist, it is going to land you in jail.
Thank you so much, Mbazima. And it's lovely to see such a diversity of thinking on the subject, because I think it's only going to enrich and enhance our conversation. Buwang is, go to jail, go straight to jail, do not pass begin. These measures that we are trying to talk about now haven't really worked successfully in the past, and nothing's going to change, really. We need something stronger. Mark is talking about other ways that we need to explore to deal with racism. Christy is saying these are systemic issues. We can't individualize racism. And Mbazima rounding it off there with Germany's speech laws, as you know, rooted in history, and identity. So anyone denying the Holocaust is deemed to be undermining a sense of, of what post-1945 Germany is. And in that context, should we be looking at racial epithets in a similar way against the history and effect of apartheid, with the consequence of undermining post-1994 South Africa? I think that's really the point you were trying to raise there, Mbazima. And maybe I'll give you the opportunity then to reinforce that point, that as strict as that boundary is and ring-fenced around those two particular issues, the punishment is clear. And maybe to just differentiate the question for you in a sense, what do you think the consequences been by placing it and making it so ironclad in the German context that might be, a sermon on effectiveness for South Africa?
Thanks. I think that the first thing that South Africa has done is to say, let's put in a new constitution. This constitution that allows all of us freedom that for many years we did not have. And say freedom comes with responsibilities. Some of it is to right the wrongs of the past. So I don't think that the position is that, look, everything post and before 1994 is wrong and should therefore never be utilized. There will be people who make films. There'll be people who take the mickey out of some of us. But I think the point I am making is that we need to reach a stage where we are able to say, race was so defining an issue in our country that if we want to move forward, yes, we need to educate everybody to know that racism is wrong, assuming there are people who don't know that it is wrong, but I think people know. But yes, we give them the benefit of the doubt. But I'm arguing that we need to be able to say, if you persist and or you engage in what comes across as blatant racism, as just hate speech, there must be laws that says you will be jailed. You will be sent to jail. What the punishment in itself will be, the courts will decide. But I think once people know that, look, it will land you in hot water. It is not just going to be sparrow there, catso there, and all of that. It's going to be many people. It is something that is going to be dealt with much more succinctly, in my view.
Mark, just want to come back to one of the themes we raised in the beginning. I mean, hate speech is a toxin, undoubtedly. Clause 3 of this proposed bill makes any crime motivated by hate that bit more serious, and so it will carry a heavier penalty. And the bill, as we've just been sharing with our audience, aims to criminalize it. Is this necessary? And obviously, you already set your intention on that perhaps it's not. Share with us what there is already in law to deal with this very serious issue.
Yes, there's a difference between a hate crime and hate speech. Hate crimes, what we do is already in determining what someone's sentence should be. If they're motivated by hatred, it's part of our common law that can play a role in determining what their sentence would be. So there's a sense in which that legislation is codifying a position. With regards to the hate speech portions of the bill, it's novel in the sense that it would be introducing criminal sanctions for the first time. It is clearly unconstitutional in the way that it is currently drafted. So the Constitutional Court in Kwalani, dealing with the Equality Act, which is a civil statute which has no criminal sanctions whatsoever, says that you must have a conjunction between speech which propagates hatred against the group. It must also then incite harm or be harmful. What the bill does in its current form is water that down. So firstly, it says that harm can be emotional harm, social harm, economic harm, and that you only need to have speech which is harmful for it to amount to hate speech. And the grounds in which someone could be targeted go far beyond those highlighted in the Constitution. So the Constitution talks about race, gender, ethnicity, and religion. The bill has 17 grounds, which include language, culture, and belief. So it's self-defeating. So Bwang expressed the view that racists are vile and should be jailed. Now, the difficulty is that someone who holds a belief, which is, let's say, that one race is superior to another, you are now calling for them to be harmed, to be jailed, and now you have performed yourself an act of hate speech. So it's a self-defeating law. It clearly doesn't pass constitutional muster, and it's something that should be resisted. The other thing that I wonder if the other panelists have a view on is who they want jailed. Who are the people that they feel that have uttered speech that they think should be sitting in a jail cell right now? Do they think that it matters who you target? So Julius Malema said that he won't call for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. This shows some strong antipathy towards a racial minority in South Africa. Should a prominent politician be jailed for saying this? So Valapi Kumalo said that we should do to white people what Hitler did to the Jews. They should be burnt alive and their children should be turned into garden fertilizer. Now, in the Equality Court proceedings, Mr. Kumalo was required to make an apology, but he wasn't jailed. I wonder if the panelists think that he ought to be in jail. This is expressing a particularly vile view. Now, my grandparents fled Nazi Germany, and I think of the Holocaust as being one of the greatest crimes against humanity. South Africa doesn't currently have a law which prohibits the waving of swastikas or the denial of the Holocaust. Now, I think that when people do either of those things, they're doing something incredibly vile. But the fact that they are free to do it in South Africa and that it almost never happens gives the Jewish community the ability to see how much of an appetite there is for those things because people have the freedom to do it. And if occasionally it does happen, they can counter-dialogue it. They can take those anti-Semites to the Holocaust Museum and they can show them the error of their ways, which has often borne fruit. So the former head of the SRC at Wits had said that he described himself as a friend of Hitler. And he was then taken to the Holocaust Center through his own volition. He could understand what that meant, and then he could apologize. And that might be a much better way of combating hatred than to use, as I say, the strong sanction of imprisonment. I think we must be wary of that cost.
Bwang, I'm going to toss it directly to you then, because in a way it's in opposition with your thoughts, and maybe to tease out the question that Mark is posing around, who should be jailed, which also converges with the question from our audience. And by the way, if you're on YouTube, the comments are open, so you're welcome to put your questions there. This one from Don Brown, Bwang, what are the elements to prove racism, and can you cite a court ruling against it? If you don't have the reference, it's fine, Bwang. I'll also ask the rest of the panel if they have a reference in answer to Don Brown's question. cite one court ruling against it. Go ahead, Boang.
Yeah, look, the current regime of civil sanctions are inadequate to address or deter racists. And this has partly been responsible for creating a conducive environment in which racism thrives and flourishes in the country. And the hate crimes bill, I agree, it should be amended, but it should enable us as a country to make the strongest possible condemnation of racism, hate speech, and racial discrimination. Any person, irrespective of race, if their conduct is found to be racist, should face consequences. We need to ensure that the impact of this evil on individuals and communities is addressed once and for all. In the Equality Court, at this present moment, the court can order one to make a public apology. We are tired of contrived apologies. The objects of the Equality Act are meant to also assist in deterring would-be or offenders or people who utter racist remarks. But we've seen that over the years that this has not really worked. And my view is that an appropriate response to this harm is through severe criminal sanctions. We still have civil rights groups in this country who propagate group identity, who continue to delegitimize the struggle of the African majority, who are in the main victims of racism. And during my tenure at the commission, we made a finding against a Black person. The spokesperson of Ongwati municipality in Paris, we made a finding that his conduct was racist. So this would not be the first time that a Black person is found to have been racist. In the Julius Malema incidents, at the time the commission solicited a legal opinion which found that his remarks did not amount to racism. So we have to deal with the factors that inform racism, such as our economic context, which is a challenge. For as long as we have a small pool of Black players in the mainstream economy and others being excluded from the mainstream economy, we'll continue to have incidents of racism in the country. And it is important to us to also address those systemic and structural issues as we address this evil.
Thanks, Boang. Christy, I want to open it up to you because between Mark and Boang, there's an interesting point that's being raised around the definition of racism. And Bazima was talking about the German context where some would argue it's very specific what you can be found guilty of because those are, almost more easily definable terms, Holocaust denying, wearing the swastika, and those sorts of things. Whereas racism is far more broad and and nebulous in trying to define, determine, and pin someone to. So in your research, what does your research say around this in terms of both the definition and, what it would mean, especially when it comes to, finding or accusing someone and finding them guilty of racism? We need your mic, Christy, sorry.
Sorry. For me, again, the systemic question comes in because it is about, and this is also something that the Constitutional Court has confirmed in its understanding of this question. And that is, so when we're talking about racism, we're talking about a particular impetus towards justifying the subjugation of a group of people on the basis of them being racialized as other to white. So this idea of the justification of white supremacism, of white domination, of the subjugation of people who are racialized as black or brown or whatever the case might be. So that for me, that is but ultimately it fits into that individual act of hate speech would fit into this, or should fit into this bigger understanding around systemically what is being attempted. In that sense, I'm not arguing that individuals must be left off the hook at all, but I'm arguing for more effective remedies where we actually address the problem of racism down to individual level. But for me, putting somebody in jail is not the way to do it. And what I'm concerned about is that we actually by going to the criminalization option, we are, in my mind, actually giving up on this idea of us as South Africans finding a way to live together in this country and finding a way to craft a common vision for ourselves. So for me, it's we know already that if you look at discourses of the past few years, how the whole idea, I mean, social cohesion has dropped off the table. Reconciliation has now got a bad name. I remember in the early days of the 1990s, early 2000s, we were still talking about things like nation building. All of that seems to have now fallen off the table. And for me, this is the response of a government that is unable to actually deal with one of the big reasons for the social cleavages in our country. And that big reason is socioeconomic inequality. So this for me is actually a distracting move, which is yet again a systemic question. It's a distracting move to where we're now going to pin racism and put racism into individuals, and we're going to punish them. For me, it's not addressing what are the most pressing problems in South Africa. Why do we still have racism being perpetuated? How do we address that? How do we actually bring people together, closer to one another, rather than further apart from one another? And it is noticeable to me. I'm just noticing also, in terms of what Mark was saying earlier, that this the bill that's before Parliament yet again, the wording is completely in terms of how it's being phrased. It actually it ignores what has been found and said so far in relation to the difference between the propagation of hate and the actual incitement of harm. That, for me, those are two different kinds of things. So for me, that's why I from my point of view, it doesn't seem to me as though this is a good faith attempt to really address the question of racism. This seems to me to be a populist move that is actually feeding into the current problem of social polarization.
Wow, there's so much you said there that I think we need to tease out.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think it's important to understand that he who feels it knows it. I think there are words that are said that people will say blacks are overreacting, that people of different gender are overreacting. The reality is that there are situations which, even if you leave aside hate speech, there are situations which, whether they're in a family, in a work setting, something happens, it triggers what has been done to you before. And I think the notion that if you say, let's criminalize racist on the basis of a proper legal and constitutional definition, that you therefore giving up on nation building. No, you can do nation building. You need to continue to do reconciliation. You must sort out socio-economic issues. All of those things are important. But again, it seems we say that is what the government should do. That's what the majority of South Africans must do. So the burden to forgive, to forget, to be tolerant, seem to be put on people who are on the receiving end. And I have a difficulty with that approach.
I was going to echo that sentiment. So you, in a sense, preempted what I was going to pose back to Christy, and I'll give you the first opportunity, Christy, to respond to that. And Mark, maybe you can come in as well.
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree with the former Premier of Gauteng, Mr. Shalowa. It's definitely not up to Black people to be carrying the burden of racism, as it is also for LGBT people like myself, not to also suffer homophobic speech and having to justify why homophobic speech is unacceptable. So what I'm talking about is actually a closer attention to how do we actually work out remedies. And to my mind, the Equality Act and the equality courts do, to a large extent, actually open the door to that. But it's frequently how it's interpreted in the courts where the problem lies. So an apology, yes, I mean, I do, even though I do think there's value in apology, because if you look at also in terms of my own work around shame and white people's shame in relation to their, about their own racism in relation to Black people and so on, there is definitely a potential to around rehabilitation there. But I think we need to go much further with our remedies, and this is something that is not being really grasped or embraced frequently by our courts, where where one should be using things like community service and so forth much more effectively, placing for example, if we're dealing specifically with racism, placing white people in spaces where they have to make themselves useful, in context, and be confronted also with the reality of many Black people's, the majority of Black people's lives today, So, and in that sense, also being confronted with the effects of institutionalized racism, because that is also the reason for the fact that Black people find themselves by and large still the poorest, the more marginalized sections of our population. So for me, what I'm arguing for is not to let white people off the hook. I'm not saying that white people should be walking away. That we're talking about now in cases of racism specifically. I'm talking about more astute uses, of the Equality Act to punish people, but with a view to bringing people together, to enhancing understanding, to deepening the possibilities for people to actually to come together and have a better grasp of each other's existence, because so it's actually about confronting white people with the reality of Black people's lives as well, and to channel those energies towards, at least for that particular individual, towards actually improving Black people's lives. So more creative solutions to this, rather than the very blunt force of the law to merely criminalize people.
Thanks for that, Christy. I just want to pick up on a point, and Boang, you must come in as well, but I want to put this to Mark. What Christy is proposing is something that in the minds of an individual who is wounded now is going to take too long. The work of social cohesion, the work of institutional change, undoing the pathologies around the violence and the way, in particular, I'm talking about Black people's treatment in South Africa. That the law has got a duty and a responsibility to act now, because that project takes too long.
Yes, well, people who are victims of crimes generally feel that way. They don't like due process. They don't like the idea of having to wait. They want justice now. And so they want the person they believe to have wronged them to be punished immediately. It's why people around the world have been fans of things like mob justice. Just take the person out into the street and beat them to death. And we still have that kind of attitude in South Africa. It's very dangerous. The nature of law is such that you give people procedural opportunities to explain themselves, to defend themselves. We don't just use our vengeance. It's true that people might feel emotionally wounded in a moment, but emotional pain can dissipate. And often you don't want people acting out punishments when they're in a state of anger. You want a cold implementation of the law. There are some things that I think are good ideas. In other words, alternatives to using criminal sanctions or civil sanctions, like getting people to be embedded in communities. There's an example of a black person who said that he'd like to kill white people with a bazooka. And he was then ordered to go and do community service in a white township. And he had grown up middle class, and he said he assumed that all white people were incredibly wealthy. And when faced with this poverty, it changed his view. And he found it to be an enormously rewarding thing to have done. And he moved away from his prior position. So I think being creative about solutions is a good idea. I do worry about Christie's continual use of white people must do this. I think the point must be all people must do this. If we start to think that some groups are more capable of racism than others, there's a bigotry of soft expectations. It implies that black people lack the capacity to be racist. In other words, there's something in them that is impossible for them to express that view, and that just seems false to me. And Wang Jones has pointed out that when he was at the Human Rights Commission, they acknowledged that some black people were held to account. I wonder about Mr. Shalo's position about if you are doing something hurtful repeatedly, that we should then jail you, and saying, let's just do it constitutionally. I want some specificity. So let's think about a couple of instances where people have been accused of racism, and would you want them jailed? So if we think about the artist who painted the spear, depicting Zuma in a Lenin-esque pose with his penis hanging out, a lot of people said this was a racist painting. Should that painter have been put in a jail? Similar allegations were made about Zapiro in his Rape of Justice cartoon, a cartoon which is enshrined in our National Gallery. It was claimed that it was hurtful and racist. Should Zapiro be put into jail? Once you have that weapon, that stick of saying you're a racist and you've hurt me and you should languor in a prison cell, it's very tempting to exercise that against your enemies. And that's exactly what the National Party government did against people. It would say, you're a troublemaker, you've done something that causes discord among the races. There was legislation that used that terminology, and people were jailed. People were jailed for using insignia that were viewed as improper. So people were jailed for having the ANC flag on a mug, for example. There is a danger in doing this, and we must recognize that there are other solutions towards speech that we disagree with, besides putting people in prison. And also we must recognize that our views on that shift. So for example, a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, which was regarded as an incredibly powerful anti-racist novel, a novel of the civil rights movement, is now being decried as a racist novel because it makes use of racial epithets in it. Should we be jailing those high school teachers who teach To Kill a Mockingbird? What principles are you going to put in place to prevent this? And I think we need some specificity, because it's very easy to say, lock up the guilty, but you need to explain to me how you're going to determine that and on what basis.
Boang, I'm going to put those questions straight to you, because I know that you have some strong views on this as well. And maybe also just to include a question from our online audience. The Constitutional Court recently ruling that the gratuitous waving of the old South African flag was a form of hate speech. Nobody wants to defend that flag, but is it something people should be locked up for?
Just some clarity, the Constitutional Court hasn't made such a finding. The High Court had made such a finding, and the matter is currently on appeal before the Supreme Court.
Thank you, and that's why we have a lawyer in the room. Go ahead, Boang.
We still have a challenge as a country of apartheid denialism, denying the pain of Black people. And that's something that we have not adequately dealt with. I verily believe that most white South Africans are not apartheid apologists or denialists, but there are legatees of Van Riebeck, Potgieter, and Botha who still do not want to recognize the injustices of colonialism and apartheid. Over the last 20 years, the South African Human Rights Commission records that the most complaint that it has received, the most reported complaint is racism. That tells you that we have a problem, that there has been little attitudinal change in the country over the years, and we need to do something about it. So my take on what the prof was saying is that when we don't deal with individual cases of racism, we are sort of trivializing the harmful impact of racism on people. And we also need to find ways of ensuring that we address racist attitudes and behavior throughout the country. And I do not think that criminalizing racism or racial discrimination and hate speech will negatively impact on other constitutionally protected rights and freedoms, such as the right to freedom of expression. Using the K word, the C word, and other objectionable words cannot be condoned. And whoever expresses such racial remarks should face the full might of the law. And I do not think it is the intention of the legislator to deny people their right to express themselves, but they should express themselves in a way that affirms the dignity of their fellow compatriots.
Thanks for that, Bawang. And in fact, there's a follow-up question to what Mark's just said and what you're expressing there. Sabelwe Ngcobo says, is the statement by the lawyer intended to defend the privilege of people to be racist?
Yes, so I think there is some value in allowing people the freedom to express racist attitudes, which is that it gives people the opportunity to correct them. And I think that we must really acknowledge that South Africa has come an enormous way over time. If you say something vile and racist on social media, there will be repercussions. They aren't criminal repercussions, but there will be massive social repercussions. We know that Adam Katsovelos, for example, in expressing a racist sentiment from another country, was widely condemned by his family, by his friend circle, that the school which his children went to condemned him as well, that people know that racism is wrong. And so there are other mechanisms. And if you criminalize it, you drive those views underground. You don't make it go away. Unfortunately, it is the case that some people will never be able to get rid of those attitudes. And you might be able to scare them away temporarily with a big stick of imprisonment, but they'll fester and they might bubble up in other ways that are more dangerous, that you'll have real acts of violence.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mbazima, let me turn that to you then. Just that point around what the consequences are of driving down or driving into invisibility, although it's bubbling there in its own sort of toxic way, that it would have, it's counterintuitive. And it ties in with this question from Anonymous in our YouTube audience saying, won't putting people in prison for racism create martyrs? Just drawing more attention to these terrible individuals. Isn't it attention they often want?
Let me start by saying that I think what Mark may have missed is that I did say that there is a bigger scope and room for artists, people like Zapiro and so forth, provided it's used by way of education, social issues, and all of that. Zapiro cannot draw a racist cartoon aimed at denigrating someone and then hide behind that it was satire. So there is satire and there is racism and hate speech. So those things will always be different. It's less about how I feel. It's more about what the law would have been able to outline would happen. Secondly, sure, it is true that the preference is not to put people in jail, is to talk to people. But you see, what we're being asked is that, every time someone spit at me, I might just wipe off my face in terms of that spit and then try to want to have a discussion with a person to understand why they are doing it. Somebody spit at you because they really think you are nothing in this world. And that person must be able to pay for their thing. So I don't think that anyone who gets jailed for being vile, being racist, and obviously it would have gone to court. Remember, there's not going to be a law of the jungle. Someone will go to court to say, this is what they did, this is what they have said, whether it's in terms of homophobia, whether it's racism, whether it's albinism, and so forth. Somebody says, let's kill this one because they are an albino, and therefore we're going to be able to get moody. You need to be able to deal with that. Sure, you need to educate society to know that those things don't work, but those people must be jailed. So I don't think that there's going to be a martyr out of people who are going to go there. I don't even think it's going to be driven underground. If anything, it is there underground. It is being spoken of. The reason why people can say these things publicly is because they say it during Bryce and everywhere else, and everybody just laughs. It's the same with people and sexism. They make sexist jokes amongst themselves. Everybody laughs. And then the next thing, they make it publicly because they think everybody loves their jokes.
Thank you, Mbazima, for taking us back there. And just to note to our panelists, I know that we're really squeezed for time, but if there's something that really struck you in the conversation, please just make a note of it and come back to it in your closing comments. If you are watching by YouTube or any of the other social platforms, please feel free to just write us questions. Christy, I want you to tackle this next one for us very quickly. And we raised it at the beginning, but I think it kind of got lost a little bit in the ether, is just definitionally what we are talking about. The difference between hate speech and freedom of expression. Tundi on our online audience says, it seems the issue of hate speech and racist speech and racism are being addressed as one when they are not. So maybe just tease apart what we're talking about.
Well, so hate speech that is racist is then speech that would be advancing racism and particularly harm against people who are racialized as black or brown and so on. So for me, it's very important for us to keep in mind the question of harm and the question of incitement to harm. So in terms of making sense of racism broadly, and then what would be racist hate speech and what would be a racist hate crime. And just to link further onto that, if we, Mbazima has mentioned, for example, with gender-based violence, violence against women, and so on, we've already got various, further penalties that are actually added on, as part of aggravating circumstances in certain gender-based, gender-based violence and also violence against women. And so you have further criminal basically punishments that are added in terms of our law. And so I want to. So for me, it's not a question of yet again of letting people off the hook, but it's a question of particularly as some of the commentators that have lodged contributions at Parliament have argued that what must be the offence that we're trying to identify must follow the harm, not the speech. So if we're thinking about it like that, then and this is something that I support, is where we actually look at our criminal procedure laws and we actually add the question of a hate crime as a further aggravating factor in sentencing. So that's how you address this whole question of a hate crime, so that there is a real penalty. In the case, because we need to distinguish between speech and actual physical injury, death, murder, and so forth. If we look at hate crimes in South Africa, in fact, specifically marginalized groups like black lesbian women have been targeted in hate crimes. So that should then be an aggravating factor. The fact that the victim was targeted because of her sexuality, because of her gender, and this should be done in terms of criminal procedure laws. For me, this does not belong actually in hate speech legislation. And I think that we need to turn back to our Equality Act and address the question of hate speech through our Equality Act, and also as directed by the Concord with the most recent Kwelani finding as well.
All right, so with 8 minutes or so left before the end of our conversation, and I warned you the time would disappear like water in a colander. Just to recap for everyone who's joining us, we're looking at the bill. It significantly widens the definition of hate speech. Right now, the Constitution says freedom of speech doesn't extend to the advocacy of hate based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. This bill will now make it illegal to promote hatred or harm based on someone's age, albinism, birth, color, culture, disability, ethnic or social origins, the gender identity, and a range of other categories. It also enlarges the definition of harm to include, as one of our panelists said, not just the physical harm, but emotional, psychological, and other types of harm. Some on our panel have already said we've got enough, and in fact, a lot of the critics are saying we already have enough adequate measures in our law to deal with hate speech. You've got crime and injuria, you've got assault, you've got incitement, or you can also, initiate action under the Equality Act. But here we are, and maybe just in wrapping, for each of you, just to take about a minute or so to leave with your strongest point. I think, Mark, I'll kick off with you because I want you to add into your quick closing comment. You say there are sufficiencies in law as they are, and only when you can prove causation, I think is the legal term, or when you can prove that what you said actually caused somebody to do something negative out of that caused harm to someone else, then we should look at a type of criminal punishment. Just clarify that for us and close as well.
Yeah, so the first thing is just to say the Constitution goes on that it's not the mere propagation of hatred against those four groups. It's that there must also be the incitement of harm. So that's what our constitutional standard really is. What the court in Kwalani says is that in a civil setting where you can only hand out fines and apologies, that you can water down that standard slightly. But in a criminal setting, we rarely, and very few countries, criminalize hate speech. You need to be using the ordinary criminal standards in the law. Now, the Constitutional Court in Kwalani has said that you don't need to prove a causal link between the speech and the harm actually resulting. And that, I think, is a fair standard to have on a civil standard. In other words, where you only have these kind of financial penalties. In a criminal case, you might think if you're going to jail someone for their speech, then you do want to use that ordinary criminal standard of saying that the speech went and caused an actual harm to result. That because the penalty is so big, because you're depriving someone of their fundamental freedom, you must use those ordinary criminal standards. And I think that's not being taken into account in the bill at all. I would emphasize that we have alternate mechanisms for combating racial hatred. And we must recognize the trade-offs, the sort of real consequences of the consequences. So, for example, one of the types of harm that's described is economic harm. So you can imagine someone calling for a boycott and saying, don't buy goods from people who are Afrikaans, so a language group. Now you have infringed the hate speech bill and you can be jailed for it. That seems strange to me. It seems like that's the kind of thing where people ought to be able to have a lively debate. I don't think you should be boycotting people because they speak Afrikaans, but I think the best way of dealing with that is through counter dialogue, not through imprisonment.
So let's keep the lines of communication open. Boang, what's the right punishment then after everything you've heard this morning, this afternoon?
Well, the right punishment is jail, is a term of imprisonment. I think this is an appropriate and acceptable means of advancing the goals of substantive equality and multicultural tolerance in South Africa. There are a few pockets of individuals who still subscribe to racist beliefs. I do believe that a majority of South Africans, irrespective of race and color, subscribe to an ideal of racism-free South Africa. They far outweigh the few people that Mr. Oppenheimer is speaking on behalf.
Wow, that was so short and so sweet. I thought you were going to say more, Boang.
Sorry, just one point of clarity. I want to check who he thinks I'm speaking on behalf of. It implies that I speak on behalf of racists, and that strikes me as rather defamatory and false. I don't. I speak on behalf of law enforcement.
I believe Mr. Oppenheimer represents the view of the client is represented in most equality cases who happen to be legatees of apartheid, who continue to undermine the struggle to unite this country.
Yes, that strikes me as dangerous. By the way, one of my prior clients was Boang himself when he was at the Human Rights Commission. And as you might know, all advocates subscribe to the cab rank rule. We don't pick our clients. But that sort of, in other words, targeting NGOs to say, I don't like your politics, be nice if we could jail you. That's the danger in Boang's position. And I think we must recognize that, who he really wants to imprison. There are going to be many NGOs that are going to say things that would be protected under our constitution. And I'm sure he'd be very happy to see some of the people who run those organizations laying behind a prison cell. That strikes me as pernicious.
Again, and in these conversations, one always says, we wish we had more time to do more chapters and to tease out some of these very important themes and these pushbacks that we're discussing right now. Christy, in wrapping as well, I want to put this to you from Moonchild. How can you legislate about hurting people's feelings? Absolutely ridiculous and indicative of all the snowflakes who want to live their lives in safe spaces instead of being out in the real world.
I have to say, I do have an issue with these Americanisms that are always brought into our debate. I think we've got enough terms here to grapple with our difficulties and so forth. And I do think that this is a tough public debate that we are in. We are in a very difficult phase of our attempts to create a democracy in South Africa. I can understand the frustration that Mbazima and Boang have both spoken about in terms of persistent racism. Dealing with racism. What Mbazima was talking about. The humiliation of somebody spits on you. I mean, of course, which so one can completely understand the frustration. Even though as a white person, of course, I can't put myself fully in your shoes, but at the same time, I feel that we need to be more creative. I recall us having a point in our recent history where we had much more imagination in terms of what we wanted to do with our country. We had the vision in our constitution. We still have the vision of our constitution in terms of the kind of society that we want to create. And I want to call on us to be more creative, to come together, to keep on having these kinds of conversations. This News24 hosting these kinds of conversations, other platforms as well, so that we can keep on grappling with these issues. But for me, criminalization is that step too far. For me, our collective imagination must allow us to come up with remedies that are punishments on the one hand, but do also speak and actually resolve or work towards resolving our massive problem of social polarization, which has become even worse in recent years. So in a sense, we're failing one another by simply grabbing at the blunt instrument of the law and not coming up with more powerful ways, actually, in which we can garner understanding for each other and actually together tackle the big problems that we face in our country, which is yet again socioeconomic inequality, which is very much race-based. What are we doing about that as South Africans, and how can we all get involved? And I just want to quickly add, I know I'm talking too long actually, but the July protests last year and how we saw communities coming together afterwards, or if we think about the Solidarity Fund and the kind of, how that drew people also together in terms of, in the COVID-19 pandemic and so forth. For me, those were kinds of old sparks again about, the kind of society where we can come together across these terrible cleavages that apartheid has caused, among us. Thanks.
Mbazima, you have the final word before we wrap.
Yeah, just to say that in my work in the trade unions and everywhere, people don't like legislation. The minute you say, let's codify, let's legislate, they say, no, but there are other remedies. When the time comes to use these remedies, they are saying, no, but there are other remedies. We started by saying, let there be a fund right at the front put forward by Bishop Tutu to ensure that we'll use this money to rebuild in the same way that people pay for Nazism, Holocaust, everywhere else in other countries. We said, yeah, no, we don't need to do that. We're a special kind. Let's talk about all of those things. In the end, it's very clear that we ought to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, we must dialogue. We must educate people, but there must be laws which will ensure that if those are violated and the courts of law have proven beyond doubt that these laws were violated, people must be jailed if that is what is going to happen.
Thank you so much to our panel. I'm only loath that we are out of time. I think in setting up this particular discussion, on behalf of News24 and the campaign for the freedom of expression, the intention was to tease the themes out, to excavate what we have already in the discourse, and to share with people who aren't familiar with the bill what its implications are likely to be. What I can guarantee is that we were never going to have the all-encompassing conversation around an 8-year legal journey in 1 hour. So I applaud you for doing the best that you can. And I think we really got enough meat and things to wrap our head around. And the other thing that we can't do is undo the pathologies and the pains of so many years of what we've experienced in this country that have brought us to this point of where we do need sobriety, where we do need clarity, and where we do need to know how to move forward in the way, Christy, that we can build the type of social cohesion and that picture you were painting a little bit earlier on. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone in the audience for logging in. It's not going to be the end of the conversation, and we'll watch developments in the space as the legal process unfolds. So thank you very much again, and have a great afternoon.